Stuart. I'm very happy to be here with all of you, even in the virtual format. People of my age are not quite used to this, but I will do the best I can. Actually, Deadliest Enemy is not my most recent book. My most recent book is called The Killer Across the Table, co-written with John Douglas, the FBI agent who was the original Mindhunter and one of the books in our series. But it brings up an interesting point, I think, which is that the two fields that I seem to have gravitated into are criminal justice, behavioral, criminal behavior profiling, if you will, and the other one is public health or epidemiology. The natural question would be, well, what do these two things have to do with each other? And the answer, I think, is that they're both detective stories. They're both deadly mysteries that have to be solved. Whether you're talking about a police detective or a disease detective, they're both dealing with life and death issues, and those seem to interest me. They scare me, but they also interest me because in both cases, you are examining what for we in English majors call the human condition. It is the human condition writ large at the extremes. You see people having to deal with the extremes of human behavior in very challenging situations, and that brings out high drama in both cases, in many cases. High technological drama, high medical drama, and high human drama. So to give you a little bit of background on Deadliest Enemy, which I happen to have right here, it's coming out in paperback soon as well. This is very strange looking at myself as I talk, by the way, but it came out in 2017. In fact, Mike Osterholm and I proposed the book in 2014 in the midst of the West African Ebola crisis. We finished it in 2016 in the midst of the Zika virus crisis. We looked back as we wrote to the 2002 SARS crisis, the 2008, I guess, 2008 and 9 H1N1 influenza pandemic. In between, we had the MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome crisis. And there's my wife is coming by to say hello. And now we have, of course, the COVID-19 coronavirus crisis. What do these all have in common, one might say? What they have in common is that we weren't prepared for any of them, and we should have been. Now, what's interesting from a literary point of view is when Deadliest Enemy was first published, it got very good reviews from both the press and the public health community, and sold very few copies. People really weren't interested. They didn't want to hear about something that was that grim and that hard. They didn't want predictive kind of nonfiction, I guess. And then all of a sudden, we get the coronavirus, and the book has become a bestseller 3 years after it was published. A very unusual situation, one I've certainly never experienced. And it's weird to think that all it took for this book to become a bestseller was a major world pandemic. So I don't know what to make of that, except we hadn't sold any foreign rights. We've now sold in 12 countries. So one thing that I can say to you writers is you just never know. You never know what's going to happen. So having said that, and we can talk about the other kind of detective work if you like, but Stuart, why don't you start us off and tell me what readers would like to know, and we'll see what we can come up with.
Sure. A couple from the English and writer side of things. The first one being, I know you've written several or co-written several books, including Deadliest Enemy. Can you speak to the collaboration process and how how that works?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because it's different with every co-author. With John Douglas, who is again the personification of the Mindhunter, the one who I came up with the title for, a great character who I met while I was doing a film about the FBI's behavioral science unit for PBS science series Nova back in the 1990s. In fact, the film was essentially, we billed it as the real story behind Silence of the Lambs, which it was. John and I have worked together for over 20 years now, and we say that he is a detective masquerading as an author, and I'm an author masquerading as a detective. So we can both do sort of both, but in that case, I do most of the writing. We talk about it, I do the writing, and then we again talk about it. He'll go over it, we'll change it. It goes through that kind of process, mainly based on his experience. With Mike Osterholm and my previous collaborator in that field, Dr. C.J. Peters, with whom I wrote a book called Virus Hunter. Any of you who remember Richard Preston's bestseller, The Hot Zone, Virus Hunter was sort of that true story because C.J. Peters was the hero of that story. In any event, with Mike Osterholm and C.J. Peters, it is a much more collaborative process in that we will outline each chapter together, discuss it. I would write it up. In this case, it would go back to Mike. He would change it, it would go back to me. And so the collaborative process really is personality driven. Each collaborator is going to work differently. I know a few fiction writers who collaborate, and anything from one person writes and the other person outlines to they swap chapters with each other. One writes one chapter, one writes the next, and then they trade off. So there's all kinds of different ways of doing it. And I think as a writer, you need to be flexible and fluid. The one thing I'll say about both cases is, and all of my work in documentary films, is that I've been very fortunate in that I've been able to live many lives vicariously. I've gotten to hang around very interesting people and watch how they work and how they go about their lives. And so I think part of this process for any writer, is just having a natural curiosity and, I hope, a good sense of empathy. Because if I may go back to both sets of books for a while, everybody talks about the disease, everybody talks about the criminal, but the people who are the victims are the real story. Whether it's a victim of a crime or a victim of a disease, those are the people you really have to personalize, and that's really where the human drama comes in.
And so, kind of to piggyback off of that, what drew you to topics like this?
Well, I don't know. I guess on one level, I come from a medical family. Even though I was not very good in science, my late father was a doctor, started out as a pediatrician and became a psychiatrist. Both of my younger brothers are doctors, one in emergency medicine and the other in radiology. So one of them is married to a gastroenterologist who actually specializes in liver transplantation. So I guess I come by it naturally. I think I was always interested in mysteries. Before I got into either field, I'd written several novels. My first novel was called Einstein's Brain, which had sort of a medical science fiction aspect to it, and did well enough that I was able to continue in that business. And so to a large extent, I think I was just driven by the mystery and the fascination, and really why most of us do this, which is to learn as much as we can about why people do the things they do, or why people react the way they do. Part of getting into true crime as opposed to crime fiction, and part of getting into true science, if you will, true medicine, was kind of the people I met, the things I fell into. I wish I could tell you that I had an organized plan for my career. I didn't. I was just kind of open to things as they came up. I started working in journalism for the Washington Bureau of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch after college. I did a lot of documentary film work, so I was just kind of open to things as it came up. And you know, you're always looking for good characters, and so when you find one in real life that you can write about, that's quite a bonus.
And just to get into your head a little bit, what's it like researching and writing about these really destructive forces, whether it's you know, whether it's a serial killer or a
Yeah,
pandemic?
that's a good question, and I get asked that a lot. I particularly get asked what I dream about, and the answer is I don't dream about this kind of stuff very often. As we get closer to deadline time on any project, what I tend to start dreaming about is the classic school anxiety dream. Either I'm back in high school or I'm back in college. The final exams are coming up. I haven't studied. I don't know anything about the subject. In most cases, I haven't even been to class and don't even know which classes I'm supposed to go to. And so I'm probably more concerned at this point with getting the work done and getting it done well than I am with the subject matter. Although I guess to a certain extent, you have to be like a doctor or a detective, which is you have to be very serious about the work, very serious about the subject matter, not so serious about yourself. And by that, I mean, you can distance yourself and still have the empathy and just kind of stay with it. Certain crimes obviously bother me more than others. We all have our hot buttons. I happen to get very emotional about crimes against children and crimes against animals. That's just me. Other people have different hot buttons. And there's certain kind of illness and disease that bothers me more than others. Fortunately, I've been able to maintain enough critical distance from infectious disease work, viruses, bacteria, parasites, things like that, that I can still write about it fairly objectively. And I think having the privilege of working with true internationally recognized experts in the field certainly helps. And you know, there's always somebody higher up the food chain than me to worry about it, I guess is a way to say it.
So within that answer, I think there was a little bit of talk about your process, whether it's dreaming or being up against a deadline. And we had a student ask what the best way to cope. We actually had a couple people ask what the best way to cope with writer's block is, and if you've ever experienced it.
Well, I think we've all experienced it. I think it tends to be more pronounced, certainly it was for me, more pronounced in fiction than nonfiction, because look, in any case, you're staring at, well, when I started out, you were staring at a blank page. Now we're all staring at blank screens when we start work for the day. But if you have a subject matter, if you have something, if you're writing based on interviews or research that you've done, it's easier to get started. Fiction is more difficult. It's very uncontrolled. You don't know what's going to happen in your own mind. I know writers who, for instance, my friend Jeff Deaver, who is a internationally best-selling fiction writer of thrillers and suspense, he'll spend months and months and months outlining every aspect of his story, so that by the time he writes a book, and he's a master of plot, by the time he writes a book, he knows exactly what it's going to be. And the writing process itself is much easier than the research and outlining process. On the other hand, my late friend, Charles McCarry, who was one of the best spy novelists this country has ever produced, he would start writing not knowing what was going to happen beyond the first sentence to any of his characters. I don't see how you can write that way, but he did. I mean, and he would have intricate plot twists and things that referred back to plot devices that referred back to something at the beginning. And he said that just all came to him. I don't know how you work that way, but he did. With nonfiction, it's a little easier, as I say, because you have a subject matter. Generally, you have an outline, particularly if you've already sold the book to a publisher, you know what's expected of you. And so it's easier to avoid writer's block that way. And also, I have to say, at my age, I've been through this process enough so that I don't know that I'm better at it, but I'm certainly more familiar with it. I'm more comfortable with it. I'm less afraid of it. And the best advice I can give is you sit down and you start writing, whatever it's about. There are any number of ways not to write. I remember reading a letter by E.B. White, who said to somebody, I've been out building a stone wall around my property. And you'll find a lot of writers build stone walls because it's so much easier than writing. So there are any number of ways to find excuses not to, but you know, if you're committed, if you're a professional, you just do it. In fact, if this is any encouragement or consolation, W. Somerset Maugham, who I quote a lot on writing, said, the difference between a professional writer and an amateur is that a professional writes with difficulty. So I think that that probably says something. He also said, there are 3 rules to writing a novel. Unfortunately, nobody knows what they are. So if you accept those limitations, those strictures, and know that everybody's going through them, it's sometimes a lot easier. My late friend, E.L. Doctorow, who is a wonderful novelist, said something to the effect of, writing a novel is like driving a car through a snowstorm at night. You can only see a few feet ahead of you, but you can go that way all night. So, you know, I think no magic solutions, but that actually does remind me of another story, which I hope won't be lost on the age group of your audience. But James Michener, who was a very well-known and very successful novelist, wrote huge novels like Hawaii, and I'm blanking on others, but he wrote a lot of novels, and including South Pacific, which was called actually Tales from the South Pacific. And he was at a writer's conference once, and someone said to him, Mr. Michener, how do you make it as a novelist? I mean, what's the secret to actually being able to be a professional novelist and make money at it? And he said, well, I can only speak from my own experience, but he said, I would recommend having Rodgers and Hammerstein write a hit Broadway musical based on your first novel. So again, there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no formula. It just happens. The one thing I am convinced about is if you've got anything to say, if you've got any real talent or ability, somehow or other, and again, we don't know how, but somehow or other, you'll make it eventually.
Thank you. So we have another question here saying that your writing is both beautiful and captivating. How do you write so that it captivates an audience so well, especially when some of it may be, nonfiction?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I hadn't really thought about it before, but let's see what I can come up with. First of all, thank you for whoever you are. Thank you for the compliment. I would say that the first thing you have to do is imagine your scene. And that doesn't matter whether you are writing fiction or nonfiction. You have to imagine your scene, what you're doing. And if you visualize it and visualize the way you would describe it to somebody, you're going to have some success. The other thing that I find, and everybody has their own technique, but what I like to do is say, all right, what does the reader want from me? And the one thing I know the reader wants from me is not to be bored. That's inviolable. You cannot bore the reader. So the second thing is, well, how do I accomplish that? And the way I do it, at least for me, is I say to myself, I want the reader, male or female, and interestingly enough, more of our readers are women than men, maybe just because they're more intellectual or they like to read better. I'm not really sure. But I say, I want the reader always to be asking what happens next. Not necessarily, is it a page turner? Is it full of suspense? Although obviously I like to put as much suspense and mystery into the books as possible. But I want the reader constantly saying, okay, that's interesting. Now what? What happens next? And I think for a lot of writers, particularly young writers, if you just keep that in mind, keep asking yourself, put yourself in the reader's place and keep asking what happens next, you're not going to stray too far. Does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah, I think so. I think you answered the question. So another one here, many English majors at Drew take writing workshops in both fiction and creative nonfiction. I know you write in both genres too, and that you've explored some similar subjects in both. Do ideas for writing projects always present themselves as clearly belonging to one or the other?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And the answer is no or both. Sometimes I'll come up with an idea that actually has both nonfiction and fiction possibilities. Here's an example. I wrote a novel a number of years ago, probably one of the things that got me into the public health field, called Unnatural Causes. And it was a thriller, probably a medical thriller, I guess you would say. It took place at that time against the backdrop of the Vietnam War, which my generation went through. And one of the main characters was an epidemiologist who worked as a medical detective for the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. Now, I had never been there, but I knew that if I was going to write this and write it accurately and make it realistic, I had to go and spend some time there. So I worked some of my contacts and went down there for, I guess, about a week. This was way before 9/11. It was much easier to get into government buildings and just hang around with people, get into the labs and all that kind of thing. I even got to see where the one of the two official samples of smallpox is kept. And so I just hung around. I learned as much as I could. I picked up as much as I could. I wrote the book called Unnatural Causes, which was published a number of years ago by William Morrow. But I learned enough doing that. So I said, gee, this is a really interesting subject. These medical detectives really are interesting. And I was able to propose to PBS's Nova series a film about disease detectives hunting a particular mystery disease. In this case, it was one in the wilds of Brazil. We went down and followed a epidemiological team trying to solve the mystery of why children, no adults, but children were suddenly getting very sick, high fevers, and overnight, and then dying the next day. A very emotional subject, very dramatic, very tragic subject. But it was doing the research for the novel that actually gave me the idea for this film, which we ended up calling What's Killing the Children. You're going to see that commonality in my work. I've done films called What's Killing the Children, Mind of a Serial Killer, Who Killed Lindbergh's Baby. The new book that's coming out soon is called Shadow of a Killer. The latest book with John Douglas is called The Killer Across the Table. So fairly grim subjects, but all, I hope, interesting. And having done both the film, the documentary on the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Having done the novel, I was then in a good position when Dr. C.J. Peters' agent came to me and said, would you like to collaborate with him on his story? And so, yeah, they absolutely feed each other. In fact, I wrote a book a number of years ago, a novel called The Edge, which actually uses my collaborator, John Douglas, as a character in fiction. So yeah, there absolutely is cross-fertilization.
Great. Okay, got a couple more about kind of the writing side of things, and then a little and some about the Deadliest Enemy specific.
Sure.
So can you describe a little bit the experience of having a book picked up by Netflix and what the adaptation process with Mindhunter was like?
Yes, that was one of the strangest experiences we've had. The book came out originally, I believe, in 1995. It was short, or 1996, I think 1995, shortly after John Douglas retired from the FBI and after a full career, and was able legally to write books about his experience. The book was optioned almost immediately by NBC television. They held the option for a couple of years, and we were happy just to get the option money, but it was clear they weren't going to do anything with it. Finally, we wouldn't renew the option because we didn't think it was going anywhere, and the book, kind of was always out there. Amazingly, it kept selling in paperback straight through. It's never been out of print in 25 years now, almost 25 years, and it keeps selling. And then, sort of out of the blue, I guess, we got another offer from Fox 21, one of the Fox company's production companies, and found out that the actress Charlize Theron was interested in the story. Not to be in it, interestingly enough, but to produce it. So her company made a deal with Fox 21. They bought an option, and we talked back and forth, and then kind of nothing happened again for a while. And you get used to that in this business. I know your dad has been through this many times himself. For full disclosure, Stuart's dad is a very close friend of mine and associate. In any event, it's sort of knocked around. Nothing happened. And then somehow, we're not sure how, it migrated over to HBO, and the director, David Fincher, a very prominent director, got involved with it. He started developing the idea for a fiction series based on the nonfiction book. He had commissioned a number of scripts, which it turns out he didn't like. He threw them away. He got another writer involved and commissioned more scripts. And we didn't know what was going to happen. And then we kept reading in trade magazines and movie magazines that they were going to do a first season of it. And every time we asked, they'd say, well, it looks good, but there's no definite word yet. And finally, we were being told about it was going to be filmed in Pittsburgh, that there were ads in the local newspapers for extras and all of that. We heard about actors who were being interviewed to be in the part, and we kept saying, well, what's going on? Well, it looks good, but you don't know. And then HBO bought a series called True Detective with Matthew McConaughey, and it did very well in its first season. And as far as I can tell, HBO kind of lost interest in having another crime series. So he said, okay, well, nothing's going to happen now. But David Fincher, to my relief and his great credit, continued to be interested. He brought it over to Netflix, where he was something of a hero for not only his success in the movies, with movies like Seven and Social Network and such, but also for having been one of the originators of their House of Cards series, which was really one of the series that really put Netflix on the map, as I recall. So then again, we started the whole process again. We kept hearing good things. We kept saying, well, what's happening? Well, it looks good, but we don't really know. And then all of a sudden I got an email from the business office at Netflix that said, okay, we need your address and your tax ID numbers so we can send you a check. So that's kind of how we found out. So we were very happy with the way seasons 1 and 2 went down. We're still waiting to hear if there's going to be a season 3, because David Fincher seems to be very busy right now. But his idea was that he would take the basic characters that we had in the book and fictionalize them to the point that he could do whatever he wanted with them. But the interesting, still having the same time frame, the same cases, but the interesting thing that he did was all the bad guys, all of the serial killers who we chronicled in the book, who John met with and interviewed, and in many cases hunted, they were kept with their real names and real identities, real looks. Anybody who's seen the series knows that Ed Kemper was a spitting image of the real Ed Kemper, as was the actor, Australian actor actually, who played Charlie Manson. So we were very happy with the series. We've been very happy with the series for 2 reasons. First of all, it was very loyal to the book, very respectful of the book, even though the characters had some fictionalized aspects. The process is described very well, the process by which all of this information on how to profile was gained through these actual confrontations with incarcerated violent offenders. The second reason we were very happy is because the book, again, took off. So I have had very good experience with books that have been around for a while suddenly becoming bestsellers again. So Mindhunter has been republished in a new edition for the Netflix series and continues to do very well. And we still hear good things about it. So we had nothing but good experiences with the series. But it's one of those things, you never know what's going to happen and what's not. One thing you realize as a writer who writes what might be called the underlying properties, the book or whatever a series is based on, is it has very little to do with you, whether it's going to work or not. I was hired by New Line Cinema a number of years ago to write a screenplay based on my book, The Edge, and they liked the screenplay a lot, and I got paid well for it. But then they never ended up making the movie because the actors who were to appear in it, you've heard of them, and the director had just done another thriller for them that didn't do very well. So they said, well, that's not a good combination. So you learn to like it when it happens, but not take it personally when it doesn't. One thing you learn, and I'll tell this to all the young writers, just get used to rejection, because no matter how successful any of us are, and there are many who are much more successful than me, we've all had much more rejection than we have had acceptance.
And then I'll get one last, is a 2 related questions here kind of on the process, and then we'll get into a little bit of the more topical things. One being, in your experience, do you feel the expectations and direction that publishing institutions take are based on what cultural narrative it wants to take on or change, or simply what will sell best? And then kind of in that same vein, in the editing process, how do you handle scenes that you may love but might not be necessary to keep in the book?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and that's something we all face. And if it doesn't fit in the book, you just have to get rid of it. I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been Hemingway who said, you've got to be ready to kill your favorite children. So yeah, if it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. And I've had things that I've loved and had editors say, this really doesn't go here. And I'd say, okay, you're right. And most most writers, most books really can be helped by editors, and I've been fortunate to have some very good ones. So I don't know that publishers are looking for a particular narrative. I mean, I think they probably pick up on the zeitgeist as it happens. But by the same token, if you were able to sell a book to a publisher, fiction or nonfiction, it's probably because it's what the publisher is looking for and thinks will sell. Publishers do publish books with the idea that, well, this is a prestige book or this is a book that should be published, but no one's trying to lose money either. So I don't kid myself that anything likely to happen that I would think of would necessarily be a good book. It has to be something that I think there is a market for, that readers are interested. Our timing was terrible on Deadliest Enemy to begin with. Nobody really wanted to deal with the subject. It was just too hard and too difficult to deal with. But now we're forced to, and so people want to know about it and know what they can do or how they should react. So again, you never know. You've just got to do your best work and hope that somehow it finds its proper audience.
And I think with that, we can get into some of that, the Deadliest Enemy centric questions. And I know one you mentioned before we started here was just how would you characterize the White House response and where we are on testing?
Well, those are two separate questions which are related. I think the White House response has been shamefully late. If you track President Trump's statements on the subject, he tried to ignore the information coming out of China for 2 months at least, when we could have been gearing up, when we could have been preparing test kits and things like that. He was not the only one. A lot of people ignored it. A lot of people thought, well, this has never happened to us in our lifetime before, so it's not likely to again. So, that's not a very good way of going about things. So I think the White House has handled things very poorly. They continue to handle things very poorly with the mixed messaging, the happy talk, the encouraging governors to open up their states before it's safe to. I don't think President Trump has any real fix on this. And one of the things which we need in a crisis like this, whether it's a military crisis, whether it's a public health crisis, is we need firm leadership. We need leadership that tells the truth, which this president does not. Maybe he doesn't even know the truth. And we need a national plan going forward, which we don't have. We're only in the first or second inning of this ball game, unfortunately. It could last a long time. And we don't have a national plan for how we're going to thread that needle between total shutdown and just going willy-nilly about our business as if nothing was wrong. We can't shut down completely. That won't work. We can't just go back to business as usual. So we've got to figure out a plan to coordinate the nation. Maybe it means opening up certain areas when the virus is low and closing them down again. But whatever it is, we need a blue ribbon panel to come together of experts in various fields and figure this out. And instead, we're getting day-by-day updates by tweet. The message changes every day. The policy changes every day. I think President Trump has thread his own needle by saying he's in complete control and at the same time taking no responsibility, throwing all the responsibility to the governors, who I think by and large have done a very good job in a very difficult situation. But this should be national coordination, and it's not being. These 2-hour psychodrama news briefings we see every day are not at all helpful. I think probably people are dying because they're following what President Trump says to do and not do, and because he didn't recognize the problem early enough or pay attention to the people who did recognize the problem and go forth with that. Now, on the subject of testing, we came to that very late too. The Centers for Disease Control did not come out with a good test to begin with. We didn't use tests from overseas. And so we're way behind the game. The problem with that is by the time we did start real testing, the situation was almost out of control. One of the reasons you want to do testing is so we can do what we call contact tracing, which is you test somebody. If they're positive for the virus, you look at all the contacts they've had around them and you try to get to those people too. But once it gets progressively larger, and this virus seems to replicate or double about every 5 to 7 days, it gets too late. I mean, you can't do contact tracing in a place like New York anymore. There's too many cases there. It would be meaningless. And as far as the test kits, I've looked at some of the research very recently. Two kinds of tests. One is the RT-PCR, the rapid test polymerase chain reaction test, which uses DNA to see if a person actually you scrape the back of their throat to see if a person actually has the disease at the moment. The other test is a blood serology test, which looks for antibodies to see whether the person has had the disease. We don't have enough of either, and we don't know the quality of a lot of these tests. The FDA, Federal Food and Drug Administration, has come out with emergency authorization for a lot of tests that they haven't really reviewed yet, and it's a very mixed bag on how good they are. The other problem is we are running into a problem where no matter what we want to do, and no matter how many people we want to test, we're running out of reagents. The world is running out of reagents, the chemicals that are necessary to process either the PCR test or the blood serology test. So we can say we want to test everybody, but it's going to be months and months before we have that capability, if ever. So, and then let me just go on with that for a minute. There's also other issues involved with the testing, which I just don't think we're hearing about. In fact, we're writing an op-ed for the New York Times about that right now, which is in China, the way that they controlled the virus up to a point is they essentially shut down Wuhan, China, and Hubei province, and essentially said, you stay in your home for the next several weeks. Nobody moves, we'll bring you food, but nobody's going anywhere. I think if we tried to do that in this country, there'd be major, severe civil liberties issues. I mean, you're already seeing protests in places like Michigan, Virginia, Minnesota, where people are getting together and saying, open up society again. This is all a fraud, or we'll take our chances, or whatever. So I think you'd have we'd bet if we're gonna do a lot of testing and contact tracing, again, this goes back to national leadership. We'd better damn well define what we're gonna do with it. We better get some agreement amongst all of us, the test subjects, if you will, the citizenry, about how this is going to work, what our expectations are, what we're going to allow, what we're going to accept, and what we think we're going to get out of it. We also have to understand the limitations of the test. These are not, I'm not a scientist, but from what I've looked into, these are not like your home pregnancy tests. These are not yes, no tests. You have it or you don't. These need interpretation. They're complicated. In the case of the PCR, you have to get a swab with cells on it. You have to transcribe, I guess is the word that scientists use. You have to, in other words, transform the RNA, the genetic base of the virus, into DNA, and then amplify it, duplicate it, probably 25 or 30 cycles until there's enough to see. And then you may or may not see what you're looking for. So these are interpretive tests. They're not black and white. They're not binary, if you will. So they do have a certain error rate in terms of false positives and false negatives. So if we're going to tell people to start going to movie theaters or baseball games or shopping centers, we really want to know how good these tests are. What are the chances that someone who's tested negative could still actually be positive, or somebody who has had the virus or who tests positive for having the virus may not have had it. By that token, we assume, because of the way most other viruses work, that having had COVID-19 will confer some kind of immunity. But we're not sure about that. We also don't know whether the immunity is lasting, as it is in something like smallpox virus, or whether it's transitional, as it is in the case of most influenza viruses. So there's a lot we don't know. We're still learning every day. And I just wish the central administration, national administration, would show some leadership and say, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, but stick with us because we are in this together and we're going to work it out together. I'm not seeing any of that.
So in Deadliest Enemy, you likened the need to convince world leaders and industry leaders and the media that the threat of a pandemic is real, and that getting people to buy into the possibility of an alien invasion is almost the direct correlation,
Sure.
and that ignoring the threat until it blows up in our faces isn't a strategy. Why do you think that the experts were predicting this and there still was not enough done to prepare?
Well, the experts were predicting it because we knew it was going to happen. There have been pandemics throughout history. All we have to do is look to our own history, our own past. Pandemics of all sort, whether we're talking about bubonic or pneumonic plague, whether we're talking about cholera, whatever. It doesn't matter. We've seen these over and over again. The 1918 to 1920 H1N1 influenza pandemic probably did more damage than any event in the history of the world. I mean, it certainly killed more people than the Black Death of the 14th century. It didn't kill as much of the population because the population was much higher. But we're overdue for another one of those. If you think this coronavirus is bad, wait till we get a really bad influenza pandemic, and the world will go down the drain if we're not ready. What I liken it to a military model or a security model. Since 9/11, we have spent God knows how many billions or trillions of dollars on what we call homeland security. And we congratulate ourselves when nothing happens. And yet we don't take those same kind of precautions. We don't arm ourselves the same way for what I would argue is a threat several orders of magnitude larger. We've never had a terrorist event that's taken this many lives in this country. We spend so much money on defense against human enemies every year, which we should, but we don't prepare the same way. What if we went to war? We went to war against a major foe like China, Russia, whoever, and then we said, all right, we're declaring war. Now let's go to General Dynamics and have them build us an aircraft carrier or a set of, or fighter planes or missile systems. I mean, you don't go to war that way. You have the stuff, you have it already. You better have it already. You better have gamed out all the scenarios. We haven't done any of this. Anytime they try to game out the scenarios, I can tell you there have been a number of them, what we call tabletop exercises. The first, back in early 2001 was called Dark Winter. And everybody just threw up their hands at the end and said, well, we don't know what to do. We don't know how we would handle this. And yet it's very imaginable. We, in Deadliest Enemy, we laid out a scenario for a fictional but very realistic influenza pandemic. And it's amazing. I mean, I don't think I'm particularly predictive or prescient, but our scenario is almost exactly what's happening right now. I mean, it's eerie in a way, but it's not because we're that clever or that we had any kind of classified information. We just thought it through, looked at the evidence, and in both cases, for my crime writing and for my public health writing, it's all about evidence. It's evidence-based. You can think whatever you want, but you have to look at the evidence. And we're just not prepared to do that kind of thing. For us not to have enough what we call PPE, personal protective equipment, enough N95 masks, gowns, gloves, all of that protection for our nurses, our doctors, our healthcare workers, our first responders. That's the equivalent of sending an army into battle without helmets and rifles. I mean, you would just never do that. Why do we do it in this case?
Well, I can certainly agree that it's reading that was the fictionalization was eerie. I think the only thing that was well, not a direct parallel, was calling it I think you called it the Shanghai flu instead of what.
Right. Well, and so what we say is we didn't know this was going to be a coronavirus. We didn't know that would be, although our chapter on coronavirus in the book was called SARS and MERS, Harbingers of Things to Come. So we did know one would come at some point, but we didn't know that the next big pandemic would be a coronavirus. We'd never heard of this one. Nobody had. We didn't, at the time we wrote this, nobody knew it existed. It was, just something that was probably passed from bat to bat somewhere in China. But we knew something would happen, and we knew it would happen and it would keep happening with some regularity. Let's look at the difference between the world of 1918 to 1920 and the world of 2020. Again, that pandemic killed about 100 million people. Compare that to the 17 million that were killed in World War I, which was happening at just about the same time or a little earlier. So 100 million people killed worldwide in a world that had less than a third of our current population, had no airplane travel, did not have billions of people a year, literally over a billion people a year crossing international borders, did not have worldwide shipping, had not encroached on the natural environment of animal hosts and reservoirs, did not have huge, impoverished third world mega cities where people are living in terrible conditions without any sanitation close together, and did not have a worldwide just-in-time delivery system where all of our products come from different places around the world. For instance, to make a Medtronic ventilator, it has about 1,500 parts which come from 43 different countries. So try to make one of those quickly, whether you have the Defense Procurement Act or Production Act in your favor or not. So the point is, you might say, well, 100 years of medical science should really put us in much better position than the people of 1918 to 1920. But guess what? All of those other factors I just cited probably put us in worse condition. And here we are in the modern age of 2020. And what medical countermeasures do we actually have to fight the coronavirus right now? None. We have none. We are working with basic epidemiology, trying to take care of the really sick people just by giving them supportive care. We're using masks to the extent that we have them. We are practicing social distancing. Those are not medical measures. We don't have any medical measures. And we could, for instance, what would have happened if we had taken SARS seriously in 2002 and said, this looks bad. We were able to nip it fairly in the bud. Only, a couple of thousand people died. But what if this could come again, something like this. Why don't we start working on a vaccine for it and come up with a basic vaccine platform? If we had done that, we would have a vaccine probably within months. Now it's going to be a year to 18 months. And think of all the death, destruction, and economic dislocation that's going to take place because we didn't want to put in the time ahead of time. I mean, there's certain things you just do out of common sense. Can you imagine flying into or out of a major airport that didn't have an active fire department on call 24 hours a day or whenever planes are flying? Now, the odds are that fire department's never been used. But can you imagine having an airport without one? I mean, there's just certain things it doesn't make sense not to do. And if you, in addition to all of the public health people and public policy people we talked to when we wrote Deadliest Enemy, we also talked to a lot of, we also talked to economists. We talked to Larry Summers, who was a former president of Harvard, still teaches up there, and was in President Clinton's and I believe President Obama's cabinet. And he said, "Look, it's a simple economic principle. The money you spend now is a tiny fraction of what you would spend to deal with the consequences if you hadn't spent the money." So there's two ways of looking. I don't mean to keep going on, but there's two ways of looking at this. Going back to sometime in the mid-90s, I was writing an IMAX film called Storm Chasers about hurricanes and tornadoes. And my producer and I, we went down to the National Hurricane Center it was then in Coral Gables, Florida, in Miami. And Bob Sheets was the director, a very prominent meteorologist. And I said, "Dr. Sheets, what is your biggest nightmare? What, in the midnight of your soul, what do you worry about the most?" And he said, "Oh, that's easy." He said, "A Category 5 hurricane direct hit on New Orleans." He said it would be devastating. That was in 1995. 10 years later, I believe it was, we got Hurricane Katrina. By the time it hit the shore, that was only a Category 3, and yet it became the costliest natural disaster in American history up to that point. Now, we knew about it. We knew this kind of thing was, the experts knew this was bound to happen. Yet very little was done in terms of strengthening the levees or doing anything like that. So that's the analogy of what we should be doing with infectious disease years in advance. In other words, strengthening our infrastructure, preparing all of the hard stuff we have to do. Then the other analogy is, okay, well, what do you do if you haven't done any of that? What do you do when you start seeing a massive low pressure system forming off the coast of Africa that's traveling across the Atlantic Ocean and looks like it's going to hit the Gulf? Well, you got about 5 days at that point. So what do you do at that point? So the analogy to what we haven't done since in the last 20 years is not preparing New Orleans for a direct hit. The analogy to what do you do 5 days before the hurricane hits is what we didn't do 2.5 months before, when we knew that there was a big problem coming and the administration and nobody else really prepared for it. So don't mean to be preachy, but there are real lessons here.
And I think we have 2 more questions here and then we'll let you go. So in the example that you outlined in the book and you've just talked about, you kind of reference it as and you mentioned earlier as being, the first couple endings are an act 1 of this
Right.
tragedy we're seeing in real time. How could acts 2 and 3 or the rest of the 9 endings look based on your research? And how long are we going to be wearing masks in public? Is it the new normal? What's likely to happen next?
I mean, you've hit the central question, Stuart, which is, first of all, we don't know, so we have to prepare. But the expectation among the experts is that this will come in waves and it won't hit everybody at the same time, but everybody will be affected eventually. So we've got to figure out a way, we've got to figure out a national strategy and a natural coordination system to be able to move our resources around to where they're needed most. Right now, they're needed in places like New York, Seattle, Detroit. We have to be able to move them around. there's going to come a time when the rural areas are going to need them more. So we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to be flexible enough to to shelter in place when necessary, to go back out again and figure out that system. We're going to have to keep it. This is all hands on deck. We have to keep doing clinical trials to find out which medications might work. There's a drug called remdesivir, which is being in clinical trials right now to see if that works. It was a drug which was tried in Ebola. It didn't work very well in Ebola. We're hoping it'll work better here. Maybe some of the quinine-based hydroxychloroquine, maybe it'll work. The problem with that is President Trump, notwithstanding calling it a miracle drug, is that dosage is very important. If you don't get a high enough dose, you get no effect, and if you get too high a dose, you can get very dangerous cardiac arrhythmias. At the same time, we haven't produced enough of it. So this is a drug that is used regularly by people with lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, and they're having trouble getting it now because of all these clinical trials. So that's a second level effect. A third level effect is that almost all of our generic drugs, life-saving drugs, and I'm talking about, not even cancer drugs so much, but the stuff that you need like to live that day, the drugs that stock the crash carts at the hospitals, almost all of them are generic, and almost all of them are produced, probably somewhere between 60 and 80% of them are produced either in China or in India with critical ingredients that come from China. Now that's a very dangerous position to be in. In my case, I had to get a new iPhone because I cracked the screen on my old one. Now, if I hadn't been able to get an iPhone because the people in Guangdong province in China had too many of them had coronavirus and couldn't work, that would not be a tragedy for me. But if I can't get my Lipitor, which lowers my cholesterol level, that is a serious problem. And that's made in China and India too. So our supply lines we really haven't thought them through. We've just taken everything for granted. But as you see, when you have a situation like this, you've got to really figure out, how do you get what you need? How do you get enough of it? And we're already seeing shortages, and we're going to see more shortages. So to answer the question that was asked, we need a national coordination. We need to game out all of the contingencies and figure out how we're going to get through this, because it's not going to be easy. We are going to get through it, but we want to get through it with the minimum loss of life, the minimum loss of production, and the minimum loss of economic vitality. Now, we can't just completely shut down. That's not going to work. There's too many people in our interconnected society that we need. I mean, we all know that we need first responders. We need grocery store clerks. Everybody's been talking about them. They are real heroes in this. But we also need sanitation workers. Otherwise, we're going to be overrun by rats and other kinds of disease. If you live in New York, an elevator repairman is an absolutely critical functional person. And for that elevator repairman to do his or her job, elevator repair person to do his or her job, they have to have a truck, they have to have the tools, they have to have the gasoline for the truck. So the point is, you keep going down the line and you see how many people are absolutely critical to keeping our society going. We are going to have to figure out over the next year how we're going to do that, how we're going to thread that needle so that we can do it balancing off the minimum casualties, because this is a war, balancing off the minimum casualties with the best chance of success. So there's no easy answer, but I'm looking to, I would love to see the president appoint a blue ribbon panel with legal experts, with healthcare experts, with economic experts, with people from industry, from people in military logistics, all these kind of things, to coordinate and figure out how we're going to get through this, because there is no easy answer. The reason I'm taking so long to give this answer is because it's not a simple one. There is no binary response to this.
And I think we have time for one more, and then we'll let you go. What did you learn in writing your book, Virus Hunter, that and what does it reveal that might not be widely known, especially relating to this pandemic in the Deadliest Enemy book? And are there any other areas of public health that you'd like to explore further?
Well, this is interesting. Yeah, I mean, probably a lot. One of the things that I found most interesting is Virus Hunter deals with the level of people who actually go out into the jungle and to start with, or wherever the plains of Africa, wherever the rainforests, to actually figure out where these diseases come from. Who they went to, C.J. Peters, for instance, went to Kikwit, Zaire, to figure out where Ebola came from. So what you realize is you have, we're talking national policy, and we're talking world policy, and I'm talking about supply chains and shipping and all kinds of economic concepts. But what's really interesting, and I guess what I got from that book to answer your question is, this starts with some bat flying out of a cave and somebody else deciding that that would be a good thing to eat, and then go and meet somebody else. And so when you see the level that this all starts on, this is the real detective work. This is figuring out, where did this killer originate from? What is its motive? How does it stay alive? You realize that viruses and bacteria, they have to have their own survival strategy. A virus is kind of a netherworld between a living thing and a non-living thing. It's basically just genetic material that can't survive on its own. But once it gets into cells, in a living organism, it takes over that organ, it takes over those cells. It can reproduce itself, in crazy, scary fashions. Bacteria are living things, and they've got to figure out how to survive too. Some of them survive by living peaceably with us. We have millions and millions and millions of bacteria in our guts. Most of them are beneficial. Some do nothing. But a little bacterium has to figure out how to survive too. If it's too virulent, it's going to kill off its host, and then what is it going to do? So they've got to, and each one has its own survival mechanism. And I guess the other thing I learned from writing that book is, no matter how sophisticated we are, and it's our wits against their plenitude, the bugs are going to be here, the microbes are going to be here a lot longer than we are. Many millions of years longer than us. And think about it. We have all of this, science, presumably, at our disposal. But here's the thing that really got to me. A human being reproduces about every 25 to 30 years. So you get about, in a century, you get a little over 3 generations of human beings. Microbes reproduce about every 20 minutes. So you can see how quickly they get to take over compared to us. And there's just a lot more of them than there are of us. And here's one more thing that I found very interesting when we were researching Deadliest Enemy. There is a cave, I don't remember the name of it, but it's a cave in the Carlsbad Caverns system in, I'm not good on geography, but I think, if I remember correctly, it's in New Mexico. Anyway, this cave was discovered around 1987. And the geologists determined it had been completely sealed off for 4 million years. In other words, nothing had gotten in or out in 4 million years. So to microbiologists, this was a gold mine, because once this cave was opened, they could then see what life was like, what things were like 4 million years ago. And the first thing they wanted to do was come in and scrape bacteria off the walls and see what was bacteria like 4 million years ago. And here's the thing that's fascinating to me. They found that about 25% of the bacteria that they collected in this cave that hadn't been opened in 4 million years was already resistant to synthetic microbiotics, antibiotics that had not been even invented until the 1980s. I mean, that gives you a sense of the power of nature. I think that's just an amazing story.
Well, that's certainly an amazing story. Well, thank you so much, Mark. We had a ton of positive feedback in the Zoom chat already, and I'm sure there's more to come. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. That's all the time we have for this evening. Be sure to check Drew's website and social media pages for the YouTube recording of this presentation. And everybody stay safe. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, Stuart. You're a terrific interviewer, and you're going to go far in this business.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Are we off?